Now to the intellectual part of the session. When we were planning this conference, we thought of an inaugural address to be given by a distinguished scholar, and the obvious choice was Professor Walzer, who sits right here, and whom you will listen to in a few minutes. And the fact that it's being, this session has been moved from the very early morning to noon has to do with the technicalities, nothing special about the nature of the inaugural address. Professor Walzer is an emeritus professor at the Institute for Advanced Study, Princeton, New Jersey, where he's been a professor of social, a permanent faculty member of the School of Social Sciences for almost 30 years, perhaps more, until his retirement. He also was the co-editor of the publication Dissent, where he served until most recently when he retired too. So he's now doubly retired. He has plenty of time to go on writing what he's been doing for many years. And I said what he'd been doing for many years because Professor Walzer has published literally hundreds of articles and about 30 books, which is quite an impressive yield, I must say. And his toil isn't over yet. For instance, he is part of the three writers and editors of a Yale University Press series on Jewish political thought, of which the third volume is about to come out, and I understand the third is not the very last one yet. So he has been publishing the list of the width, actually, the range of his publications is very impressive. He is basically a political scientist and a philosopher, so no wonder that he wrote about political ethics, including, of course, his famous work on just and unjust wars, but also nationalism, ethnicity, Jewish thought, of course, Zionism, economic justice, social criticism, radicalism, and then tolerance, etc., etc., etc. A very impressive list of publications, of course. He taught at Princeton University and at Harvard, and then he moved into the Institute for Advanced Study, where he, as I said, was a permanent member, faculty member. Apart from his major activity, that is teaching and writing, he has always been very committed to Israel and very closely connected to Israel, which he's been visiting ever since 1970. That is more than 40 years. Basically, I guess, every year, almost annually, he's been coming and staying for some time in here. And while I was debating with myself what I was going to say, it occurred to me that he already once chaired a meeting where he spoke, but this goes back some good years. When I was head of the Truman Institute, we ran a seminar which was made up of students, Jewish students and Arab students, Palestinians from Al-Quds University and students of our own department at the Hebrew University. And one of our guest speakers, you may have guessed, was Professor Walzer. And back in June 1999, which is about a bar mitzvah ago, more than 13 years ago, he spoke to our seminar. And then we used to publish monthly by the name of Truman News. So I picked up Truman News of the time, and lo and behold, listen what we decided then to cite as out of Professor Walzer's comments or presentation or discussion at the time. And here I read out two sentences of Michael Walzer, which were uttered back on April 28th, 1999, the birthday of my wife. And I quote, "When the evil specter of human suffering is very immediate, and in the absence of United Nations Army doing the job, Anybody who can, preferably neighbors or regional alliance, has a moral right and possibly even an obligation to stop humanitarian violation, end of quote. This sounds very much apropos these days in Syria. He had no inkling of what was going to happen in Syria nowadays at the time, nor did anyone else who were perhaps more involved in Syrian matters than Professor Walzer. Still, the truth of this quote is very, very impressive, I must say, and it goes to say or to prove that things that are correct and serious hold out in spite of the events that keep changing and evolving or revolving all the time. His address, this conference, of course, is focusing on the Middle East. That is mostly Arab and Muslim, and hence all of our presentations and discussions. We were delighted and honored to have Professor Walzer give us the keynote address, hoping to listen to him as he applies his wide perceptive approach and address himself to general and perhaps also some particular perspectives when he speaks on his topic, which is democratic revolutions and religious revivals. Can they happen together? Professor Walzer, the talk is yours.
So, not so long ago, I would have been afraid to talk to a group of men and women who know so much more about my subject than I do. But when you reach a certain age, you can do anything you want. And what I want to do today is to try out an argument, and I will welcome your well-informed and no doubt critical responses. So, when the first signs of the Arab Spring appeared in Tunisia and Egypt, the crowds in the streets, the kids on Facebook, all of us watching from a distance, my distance was greater than yours, we were all excited and with whatever degree of caution, enthusiastic. Here were defenders of freedom and democracy challenging tyrannical regimes. But since I believe that one of the central tasks of a political theorist is to worry, I worried. And my worry took the form of a question, which I still think is the crucial question that we need to address. Can there be a democratic revolution and a religious revival at the same time in the same place? In the Arab Spring case, the revival had begun before the uprising. How would the two coexist? Now, that's the question that I want to reflect on today as a political theorist, speculatively, without pretending to be what I'm not, an expert on any of the Arab countries now in upheaval. In fact, I will begin not with them, but not with theory, but with comparative politics, by looking at other countries where I know enough at least to tell a story about the interaction of revolution and religion. I have just finished, or almost finished, a little book about national liberation and religion in three countries where I compare India, Israel, and Algeria. In these three, in the years after World War II, national liberation movements committed to establishing secular and democratic states succeeded in doing just that. Well, democratic in two of my cases, secular in all three. And then some 25 or 30 years after independence was won, these states were challenged by a militant, politicized, revivalist religion. Three very different religions, 3 very different countries, but the timetable of the challenge was roughly the same. Now, these are not cases of simultaneity, which is what I want to get to later in this talk. In these 3 cases, religious forces figured only marginally in the liberation movement. The 3 religions were in what we might think of as a relatively apolitical phase in the 1940s and 50s. They had mostly been accommodationist in the years of colonial rule and in the years of Jewish exile, and now faced with secular nationalists, their leaders were mostly, again, passive, as if they were getting ready to accommodate a new set of rulers. By contrast, the leaders of the secular nationalists were politically active and remarkably self-confident. They all believed in the doctrine of inevitable secularization. Listen for a moment to Jawaharlal Nehru. I'm quoting from his book, The Discovery of India, written in the 1930s. Some Hindus dream of going back to the Vedas. Some Muslims dream of an Islamic theocracy. These are idle fancies, for there is no going back to the past. There is only one-way traffic in time. The Zionist perspective was strikingly similar. As the historian Ehud Luz writes, quote, the assumption that the Jewish religion was going to pass from the scene sooner or later because it contradicted the needs of modern life was accepted by practically all the Zionist intelligentsia. When Ben-Gurion made his deal with the Haredi leadership, he was sure that the Haredim were going to be in the new Jewish state a sect like the Mennonites or the Amish in the United States and nothing more. Ahmed Ben Bella, the future first president of Algeria, had views on this issue much like those of the Indian National Congress and the labor Zionists. Sitting in a French prison, he read the works of Malraux and Sartre. It would never have occurred to him to read or even to acquaint himself with the writings of Muslim theologians or preachers. From his perspective, they were irrelevant to the liberation struggle. One might say that national liberation succeeded because it was secular work carried out by secular militants. Could it have been carried out by secular militants working alongside religious militants? Well, I will want to say something about those 3 cases a little later, but first it will be useful to consider 2 major revolutions, in one of which religion was hostile to revolutionary aspiration, while in the other it was an ally. Consider first the French Revolution, which was like the 3 national liberation movements in that it was made possible by, or one of its preconditions was, the absence or relative weakness of religious forces. Still, religion in France was the recognized opponent of the revolutionaries who clashed repeatedly with the Catholic Church. Luckily for them, this was not the revived, aggressive, and militantly orthodox church of the Counter-Reformation. That church had been undercut by more than half a century of philosophical and popular enlightenment, and by the steady erosion of theological conviction, even among the Catholic clergy. So the revolutionaries won, though, as it turned out, only for a time. Catholicism came back just as the kings came back, and it's worth remembering that the final triumph of secular politics in France, the definitive separation of church and state, didn't happen until 1905, 116 years after the revolution. Why did it take so long? The best way to answer that question is to think about the Catholicism of everyday life. The revolutionaries tried to create a new civic culture, replacing Catholic ceremonies and liturgies with ceremonies and liturgies of their own, a new calendar, new holidays, a festival of reason, secular pageantry, civic oaths, and much else. But it didn't take, not after 1789 or 93, and not after 1830 or 48 either. It took more than a century of Republican effort to establish a civic culture that could stand independently of and resist the political influence of the Catholicism of everyday life. And that Catholicism was not a militant revivalist religion. It was just, so to speak, a steady religion, steady in its hostility to secularism and steady in its opposition to democratic aspiration. But consider now a very different case. The American Revolution was quite radically secular and at least quasi-democratic, and it came fairly soon after the first Great Awakening of evangelical Protestantism in the colonies, and shortly before the Second Great Awakening, whose preachers were most active in the 1820s. In America, in colonial times and in the early Republic, Protestant revivalism mostly supported revolutionary and democratic politics. But this was the revivalism of a reformed, and what is probably more important, a radically fragmented religion, where every new orthodoxy was immediately challenged. Anglicans by Presbyterians, Presbyterians by Congregationalists, Congregationalists by Baptists, Baptists by Methodists, Baptists by more radical Baptists, radical Baptists by Universalists, and every church and sect by separatists of seemingly infinite varieties. The earliest Protestant churches did attempt to capture and use state power. They tried to make themselves established churches supported by the civil authorities in Geneva, in Scotland, in England in the 1640s, in Massachusetts early on. But the churches and sects that came later challenged all the establishments and demanded and then defended a secular state, disengaged entirely from religion. So the American Republic thrived on what Edmund Burke, in his speech on conciliation with the colonies, called the dissidence of dissent. The dissidence of dissent. So you might say that the answer to the question of whether there can be a democratic revolution and a religious revival in the same time, at the same place, it depends on the religion. And religious revivalism around the world today is very different from the two Great Awakenings. Except in the United States, where Protestantism is still dominant but no longer revolutionary, revivalist religion is radically unwelcoming to dissent and unchallenged by new denominations. Its protagonists seem eager to seize and use state power against heretics, apostates, and infidels. So let's look again at the three cases of national liberation confronted by religious revival. In India, Hindutva, Hindu nationalism, out of power at this moment, remains a threat to democracy, to religious toleration, crucially for Muslims, to social equality, and to women's rights. All these are guaranteed in the Indian Constitution. National liberation, as I've already said, came at a time when Hinduism was relatively weak and the liberationists had free rein. Mahatma Gandhi appealed to religious emotions and succeeded in making Hinduism into a force for nonviolent resistance, but he did not set the agenda of the new state, and not only because of his assassination in the immediate aftermath of independence. The political leaders of the liberation movement, like Nehru and B.R. Ambedkar, Ambedkar was the untouchable lawyer who was Nehru's first justice minister and who was largely responsible for the Indian Constitution. Nehru and Ambedkar were committed secularists, often uncomfortable with Gandhi's pronouncements, and they were the ones who dominated the program and determined the program of the Indian National Congress. It's easy to imagine Hindutva as the ideology of a nationalist movement against British rule, but Hindutva is unimaginable as the ideology of a national liberation movement, aiming not only to end British rule, but also to transform Indian society, abolishing untouchability, freeing women from patriarchal restraints, giving equal rights to Hindus and Muslims, and establishing a democratic state. Of course, what the liberationists accomplished in law, they didn't necessarily accomplish in fact. Their work is incomplete and still precarious. Secularism survives in India today, in part because caste-based parties promoting the material interests of their members stand in the way of any large-scale religious mobilization. But the ideologists of Hindutva still hope to defeat Nehruvian liberalism and secularism, and their success is not unimaginable. In Israel today, secular Zionism, a hard, religiously infused nationalist doctrine, and ultra-Orthodox Judaism threaten both democracy and equality. These two are religiously dissimilar, but the appearance of the two together may be a feature also of my other cases. A militant, highly politicized, often nationalistic and right-wing religious movement coming along with and perhaps feeding off of a more generalized revival of traditional piety and Orthodox practice. That may be happening in other countries also. In any case, the appeal of each of these, of the settler nationalists and the ultra-Orthodox, must be similarly surprising to the aging militants of labor Zionism, and also to the old Indian congressmen and the veterans of the original FLN. In opposing any kind of decent peace with the Palestinians, the Jewish zealots of the settler movement have become the partners of Islamic zealots in Hamas who oppose any decent peace with Israel. The political future suggested by the Jewish zealots is a single state between the sea and the river, with a disenfranchised Arab minority, which may not be a minority for long. And here you can see in your own country the tension between revivalist religion and democratic politics. Algeria today is a secular but strongly authoritarian state. The secularism depends on the authoritarianism, and it is nowhere near as radical. The secularism isn't as radical, especially with regard to the treatment of women, as the secularism envisaged, say, by Frantz Fanon in the days when the FLN was a revolutionary organization. An Islamist movement that won an election in '91 and was set to win another has been brutally repressed. It probably could win an election again, a free election, though it has been weakened by its own brutality, and I hope also by its own fanaticism. One tract of the Islamic Salvation Front, as an example of that fanaticism, warned Algerian women against, quote, using the Jewish word emancipation to attack the Islamic values of your ancestors. Emancipation was, of course, one of the central aims of the early FLN radicals. There still are democratic and secular forces in Algeria today, strongest, I think, in the Berber districts, but it is likely that any national uprising against authoritarian rule would be dominated by Islamists. Would it produce a political regime like that of Iran today, or are there other possible outcomes? So consider Iran, where an authoritarian clerical elite rules the country and has so far managed to repress both Muslim reformers and secular liberals. There were people who thought that the Iranian revolutionaries would replace the authoritarianism of the Shah with a democratic republic. You will remember that Michel Foucault was one of them. And there were men and women among the revolutionaries who hoped for an outcome of that sort, though obviously nowhere near enough of them. In Iran today, elections are held on a regular schedule, and there is an assembly in which debates, even fierce debates, take place. But the electoral lists are purged of candidates that the Ayatollahs don't like or trust, and the powers of the assembly are constrained by the Council of Guardian Sages and by the chief sage. Iran is the first of my cases in which we can see how simultaneity works. So let me ask again, can there be a democratic revolution in a time of religious revival, religious enthusiasm, religious militancy? The answer is apparently not, though things might be different if Iranian Islam were reformed or fragmented. In Iran, secularism was a top-down creation, an authoritarian creation of the Shah. It did not survive the revolution, and the association of authoritarianism and secularism may have made the triumph of religious zealots easier. There are other instances of authoritarian secularization, Turkey and Russia, for example, and perhaps also Egypt under Nasser, Syria and Iraq under the Ba'ath parties. I can't see a clear pattern in these cases. We don't know how far Islamic forces in Turkey will go in their transformation of Ataturk's secularism. In Russia, the Orthodox Church has made a comeback, but Orthodoxy was never and isn't now a militant religion. It remains politically accommodationist, a bulwark of Putin's state. But we might speculate that in challenging and overcoming authoritarian secularism, religious faith is likely to be a more powerful force than liberal and democratic ideology. That speculative claim is now being tested across North Africa and the Middle East. In all the countries of the Arab Spring, secular liberals and Democrats on the one hand, and Islamic militants and zealots on the other, have worked together to overthrow tyrannical regimes. But once that is accomplished, these two groups are fierce and sometimes violent opponents. There are undoubtedly a lot of people who live, so to speak, in the middle, but it's hard to make out their numbers or their actual commitments. Presumably, there are secularists who would like to reach out to and compromise with religious men and women, and there are pious Muslims who are committed to a liberal state with full rights for religious minorities. But the daily news reports point to a concentration of people on each side of the middle, religious zeal matched or probably not matched by secular conviction. I can't make out how religious or secular forces would rule if either of them won a decisive victory. The secularists fear the imposition of Islamic law, as in Iran. The zealots fear an Algerian-style repression. And it's possible that both of them are right in what to expect from their opponents. But it's also possible that countries like Egypt and Tunisia more likely, will turn out to be different from Iran and Algeria. The Islamic parties that right now have the upper hand in both Egypt and Tunisia claim to have moderated their zeal and to be ready for democratic participation. That is, they say that they are ready to give up power if they lose an election, so long as they're allowed to exercise power when they win an election. In Algeria, by contrast, they were not allowed to exercise power. In Iran, by contrast, again, they are not prepared to give it up. In Turkey, for many years, Islamic parties were not allowed even to compete for, let alone to exercise power. It isn't clear today if Erdogan and his friends are willing to give up the power they currently hold, and they probably won't be tested in the near future. For the moment, Turkey is ruled by people who call themselves Muslim Democrats and who invite the analogy with Christian democracy. And that has sometimes seemed a plausible analogy, though right now it doesn't seem very plausible at all. Recent arrests of Turkish journalists, recent prosecutions of Turkish intellectuals for insulting Islam don't bode well for liberalism or democracy. But I'm sure that religious zealots are a minority everywhere. They always are. In 11th and 12th century Christendom, crusaders were a minority. The great majority of Christians did not express, and I assume did not feel, a passion for holy war. They listened to sermons proclaiming a crusade, calling for a march to Jerusalem, and they sat still. They stayed home. Surely Islam today is no different. Jihad is not a mass movement, even when its excitement seems to spread across neighborhoods and social classes. Only a small number of people actually become religious warriors or political warriors claiming to defend religion. But the minority of zealots now, as in the past, is disciplined and militant, and it can dominate a country. In Syria, it is at least possible that it can win a civil war. It can probably win elections also. Free elections almost anywhere in the Arab world will produce victories for Muslim parties that are probably loose coalitions of religious militants and people who are, some of them, religious moderates, and others go-along, get-along types ready to compromise for the sake of power and peace. If these parties are permitted to rule peacefully, I would expect to see sharp internal conflicts that the moderates and compromisers may win in some places and the militants in others. What seems clear is that secular liberals and Democrats won't win anywhere. And that probably means that the militants, at least in the near future, will determine the course of political events in most places. It is with them more than with the liberals that the compromisers will compromise. The drift will be toward a repressive religious state. And the struggle between theocrats and secularists will make it difficult to bring other political issues to the fore, most importantly, issues having to do with economic equality and inequality. Of course, economic failure, economic collapse could change the drift, though in what ways, in which direction, I can't even guess. Let me pause here and ask what it is about the revival of Orthodox or fundamentalist religion that works against liberal and democratic politics. The answer, I think, has two parts, probably more, but two for now. First, the belief that there is a singular truth makes it difficult to compromise with or share power with or yield power to people who reject this truth. It is indeed hard to imagine a political party committed to the establishment of the one true religion, rotating in office with a party committed to the disestablishment of the same religion. And second, the belief that the singular truth is known to a defined set of learned men, for now it's only men, and that it mandates a hierarchical organization of society makes it difficult to accept anything like liberal democracy. Absolute truth and hierarchy. Though I have to recognize variations among the major religions, these two are obstacles everywhere to democratic development. Let me focus right now on hierarchy, central to all the religions, though also complex and diverse in its forms. The caste system of Hinduism is the most striking example. While the defenders of Hindutva, who hope to win democratic elections in India, they can't talk openly about their commitment to social inequality, still it is true, as the Indian political theorist V.T. Varma has written, that their long-term goal is, quote, the restoration of the Vedic principles that require the functional organization of society. That is, they are defenders of the caste system and of Brahmin supremacy, though they would undoubtedly claim that they are ready to accept modernist modifications of one sort or another. Catholic Christianity is rigidly hierarchical in its ecclesiology, its doctrine of church government, and though the hierarchs today coexist with democratically elected state officials, this is a fairly recent coexistence, dating mostly from the years after World War II, when Christian democracy was born. For many decades before that, the European Church was hostile to democratic politics, which it saw, perhaps rightly, as more favorable to Protestant religious formations. Indeed, Protestantism was egalitarian from the beginning. The priesthood of all believers comes many years before the equality of all citizens. In Judaism, the division of Jewry into priests, Levites, and the rest of us has little meaning today, but it is worth remembering that in Second Temple Judea, there were 24 priestly ranks and orders, a hierarchy from which only the Romans delivered us. Today, the gap between the learned and the rest of us is a fundamental feature of Rabbinic Judaism and of Orthodox society, and the authority of the learned, the rabbinic sages, is pretty much unquestioned in the various Haredi communities. One wouldn't expect this to be true among the settler Zionists, whose religious militancy has a modernist edge, but it probably is true. There are certainly lay militants among the settlers, but their rabbis are powerful without having to win elections. Islam is, so we are often told, a radically egalitarian religion, but the Iranian case suggests that a similar division between the learned and the ignorant prevails, at least among the Shiites, and again, the learned Ayatollahs do not have to win elections in order to rule, and when they rule absolutely. In Sunni Arab states, we don't yet know how Islamic parties will govern or who will make the critical decisions, democratically elected political leaders, as in Turkey today, or religious leaders behind the scenes. Nor do we know whether or to what extent Islamic law will prevail in the courts. The hierarchies of rulers and ruled, of clerical superiors and ordinary believers internal to the different religions don't make an accommodation to democratic politics impossible, as the Catholic case demonstrates, but they do raise difficulties. The gender hierarchy, common to all Orthodox religions, raises greater difficulties. I think that it is the freedom and equality that women have achieved in modern secular societies, but also the commercial exploitation of their sexuality in those same societies that most upsets and frightens pious and also zealous Hindus, Jews, and Muslims. It causes similar fears in many parts of Christendom. The zealotry of these different religions is no doubt different, but it looks much the same with regard to the woman question, at least from an outsider's perspective. It probably isn't possible to deny women the vote anywhere in the world today where voting is an established practice. But it is possible to subject women to patriarchal rule in ways that greatly reduce the influence that their votes might bring them. the character of their education, the jobs available to them, the mobility allowed them, the dress code imposed upon them, the character of marriage, the organization of family life, their exclusion from public roles, the toleration of sexual violence. All this works to undermine democratic politics. Wherever Orthodox or fundamentalist religion is dominant, women are counted as part of the demos, but they are not equal citizens. They have little to say, at any rate less to say than they should have, in shaping the life of their own communities. And wherever Orthodox or fundamentalist religion is not dominant, the desire to subordinate women, to control their sexual lives and their working lives, is probably the driving force of religious zealotry and also in many places of right-wing politics. But I have to stop here and acknowledge that there are many women among the zealots. I can't explain that. I don't like the easy slide by secular commentators to the old Marxist idea of false consciousness. There must be attractions to clearly defined sex roles and even to subordination, especially when these are conceived as a central part of God's plan for humankind. Someone on the secular side should be trying to figure this out. At the same time, there are feminists, militant feminists, hard at work within all the major religions, religiously committed women reinterpreting the authoritative texts, rewriting the history of their faith, challenging male domination. One organization is especially relevant to any discussion of the Arab Spring, and that is the group called Women Living Under Muslim Laws, whose members have been active across North Africa and have established at least a presence among Muslims in India. The use of the plural in their title, laws, is important. They insist that Sharia law has taken many forms across time and space, and that some of these are consistent with, or at least compatible with, gender equality. The women of WLUML, it doesn't make a nice acronym, are doing what you might call, with secular irony, the work of the Lord. But it is important to note that their central offices are in London, not in any of the countries where they are working, where they might not have the freedom that their work requires. Women Living Under Muslim Laws is actually a coalition of secular and religious women working to transform religious traditions and at the same time to oppose untransformed religious hierarchies and practices. These can't be easy tasks to combine, and I have no sense of what the long-term prospects are for organizations like this one. But for now, it's enough to say that wherever women are subordinated, whether the subordination is willing or unwilling, and even if there is feminist opposition from within, the practice of democracy is diminished. For subordinated women are not active or independent participants in political arguments and policy deliberations. Let me conclude today with some speculations about the prospects for religious reform and fragmentation, about the possibility of dissidence in contemporary non-Protestant religions. Among American Jews, denominationalism has triumphed. Some would say that American Judaism has been effectively Protestantized, partly as a result of that and also as a result of the character of the new denominations, especially Reform and Reconstruction. Jews are generally strong defenders of the secular state and supporters of liberal government policies. Obviously, denominationalism has not triumphed here in Israel, where the secular religious divide is also a secular Orthodox divide, with very few Israelis occupying middle ground. Or rather, the middle ground is not marked by the kind of religious organizations that might promote a liberal and secular politics. In the Muslim world, there have obviously been major reform movements. Wahhabi Islam, the most important of them, has some resemblance to early Protestantism in its hatred of religious corruption, its rejection of shrines and saints, and its commitment to the enforcement, the coercive enforcement of morality. But for reasons I do not understand, but many of you probably do, Muslim reform movements have not yet produced anything quite like the dissidents of dissent. There certainly are serious and sustained theological arguments, not only between Sunnis and Shiites, but within both groups. There are different, significantly different schools of legal interpretation, and there have been sectarian breakaways, like the Alawites and the Druze. But yet, there isn't in the Islamic world today anything that resembles denominational pluralism. The reformers and the sectarians have not created new religious organizations that demand recognition, toleration, and state disengagement. Indeed, what we see in Iraq and Syria right now is an ongoing effort to use state power for sectarian purposes. Until that changes, I think that Islam will be, as Catholicism was for so many years, mostly hostile to democratic politics. Not necessarily hostile, not hostile everywhere, but mostly hostile to democracy. The examples I have canvassed seem to suggest that secular Democrats can only succeed in the absence of religious forces or when they are supported by a plurality of reformed religions or religious denominations. Absence or plurality. That's what defenders of democracy around the world should hope for, and insofar as we can, we should try to make contact with and support, not militarily or politically, that's not my subject here, but academically, intellectually, to support the people who are trying to advance democracy either through secular advocacy or religious reform. There is a kind of academic internationalism, the solidarity of scholars, that I think it's permissible to talk about at meetings like this. When we defend intellectual and academic freedom, we are also implicitly hoping for something like the dissidence of dissent, that is, for wide-ranging discussions and debates which are bound to produce political and religious disagreements and to help normalize that kind of disagreement in the world of orthodox or fundamentalist religion. Now, I will finish by addressing what is a very difficult question, which may or may not arise in the coming years. In many of the Arab Spring countries, the army could well turn out to be the most powerful secular, but also obviously anti-democratic force, as the Turkish army was for many years, and as the Algerian army, closely allied with the FLN, is today. Academic freedom does not flourish in military regimes, and it would be a mistake, a big mistake, for academics to cooperate with such regimes, as a number of prominent American and British professors notoriously did with the Gaddafi regime. Nor, however, would academic freedom flourish in a country ruled by jihadi militants, and there are also notoriously left-wing academics eager to defend radical Islam because it supposedly is an enemy of American imperialism and of Israel, which is another big mistake. Liberal democracy and social democracy are the only political regimes that provide security for academic and intellectual freedom, and regimes of that sort do not seem likely to arise in the Arab world today or anytime soon. But we can hope for political formations that at least leave room for the development and articulation of liberal, pluralist, egalitarian, and feminist dissent. And we can reach out to and try to protect the dissenters, and that is what we should do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Walzer, for your historical overview and insights into both present and some of the future as well. Professor Walzer was very kind, has been very kind to be willing to take some questions, and I call upon you to present your questions in a very concise manner so that he has some time left to answer. Yes, Professor Zisman.
Question and remark. First of all, thank you so much for such a thought-provoking and wide-range question. These are the things that we really engage with in Islamic studies and religious studies. As I understood, you presented two phases of national struggle and then the religious revival, and two forces that struggle against one against the other. And in my view, as I see it, this is too dichotomous. Because I think already in the time of the national struggle, religion was there. And in the 30s and the 40s, in all these countries you mentioned, and I think this was the time when religion was auxiliary, but this is a congestion of the new type of religion, the modern type, which come up then in the 60s and the 70s, when modernity fails, when nationalism fails, all these modern ideologies fail. So I think there is a process here of coming of a new religion, and religion split between the conservative and maybe you can call it fundamentalists, which you essentially put together. You mentioned many times orthodoxy and fundamentalism. I also think, well, you raised the questions of can religion be democratic, and then you said it depends on religion. But I think it depends also on secularism, which kind of secularism we talk about. Because this is also, like religion, it's not one piece. Is it anti-religious, or can it encompass religion? And there can be all kinds of integration, alliances between what people once said, the secular, liberal, and democrat, against Islamists. Yeah? Where you put the Muslim brothers? Are they the zealots, or are they another force? Yes, even when you talk about women, so of course we are all for women equality and all this, but it's important to see how the religions see women in the West, and they have very important, independent critique about how women are treated in the West, about commercialization of women's body, is about licentiousness and all kinds of things. So should also take this into consideration.
Thank you very much. Would you like to take more questions? Yeah. Another question or comment? Yes, Professor Podeh.
Thank you very much for a very interesting lecture. Two remarks or questions. The first one is a comparative note. You mentioned, of course, capitalism in Europe, and initially, at the beginning, it was very much against democracy in Europe. It took some time until they changed, and I think that maybe the challenge of dictatorship and fascism maybe persuaded them also to go in this direction. And so changes were there, and obviously we might think that changes might occur also within Islam in due course. So, I mean, whether it's a question of time until we might see some changes in the establishment of Islam, or those who preach Islam in favor of democracy. So this is one of the visions. The second one is, I think that you are mainly talking about a Western model of democracy, which is about the separation between state and religion. Now, we might think perhaps of the emergence of a different model in the Middle East that would be somewhat different, and perhaps Turkey and Indonesia already there are offering a new kind of model that tries to combine between the two, and it might be also that we'll see a third different model emerging in Egypt or Tunisia, which for me are the two more interesting case studies between Islam and democracy.
Thank you, Professor Podeh. Professor Maoz.
For the change, I'll ask something about the Jewish point that you mentioned. And you I think, well analyzed the image or the damaging influence of the Jewish zealots here on democracy. And my question, to what extent your views, which I accept, are shared by American Jews? You mentioned the constructions and the reforms, maybe in the, and they are the majority. Jews in America are concerned about Israeli security. I don't see them concerned about this point that you raised. What is the explanation? I know some, but I would like to hear what is view. What is their concern about the damage of the zealots, the Jewish zealots from the Israeli democracy?
Thank you. I think this. Thank you.
Well, these are helpful remarks, some of them critical, helpfully critical. I do recognize that the forms of religion that have the militant, politicized religions that now appear around the world, that this is something new and quite different from more traditional forms of piety and of practice. I tried to suggest in my remarks about Israel that the combination of these two, that is the politicized militancy of say the settler Zionists and the more traditional piety of the ultra-Orthodox, that pattern may be one that we are seeing in other countries also, that you get both kinds, and that the politicized militants feed off of the revival of more traditional piety. And I do agree that it's necessary to recognize not only different kinds of religious revival, different kinds of religion, but also different versions of secularism. And in fact, that is what I hope to do in this little book I'm writing, which will be called "What Happened to National Liberation." I want to suggest that the secularism of the liberationists, of people like Nehru and Ambedkar in India, or people like Ben Gurion here, or people like Ben Bella in Algeria, that the sense of inevitable secularization made them too confident, and in some ways too radical in their negation, what the Zionists called the negation of the galut, the negation of the exile. But there were similar forms of negation going on in the other liberation movements, and that the politics of negation left the liberationists with too thin a culture, and that is partly, that may help to account for the inability of the liberationists to sustain their culture to reproduce their culture in successive generations. And what we now need is a version of secularism that is engaged with, I think it would have to be a critical engagement, but that is engaged with the religious culture. Yes, Catholicism changed, and Islam can change too. It may take centuries. It may take briefer time. Time moves more quickly in the modern world. But we should recognize the resistance within the church to an accommodation with democracy. It took a long, it was hard work to create what we now recognize as Christian democracy. And am I using a Western model of democracy? Yes, of course I am. And in the national liberation movements in India, in Israel, in Algeria, these were Westernizing movements. Of course they were. And their view of the religion that they opposed was Orientalist. Of course it was. Those terms have become pejorative in modern political discourse. I don't think they're pejorative. The West, I think that the effort to create modern Western democracies in India, the efforts of people like Nehru and Ambedkar, and they were right. They were doing they were doing what ought to be done. Now, I don't think there's a single model of secular democracy. It's certainly possible that there will develop different models. I can assure you that the religious zealots will call all of them Westernizing, because they will all have that feature of a state that does not directly, deliberately promote one religious perspective over all other possible religious perspectives. The separation of religion and state may not take American forms. Even in America, it doesn't take American forms. The secularism of the American revolutionaries was far more radical than anything we see in the United States today. And I'll give you just one example of it, my favorite example. In the early American Republic, mail was delivered 7 days a week because the state could not recognize a religious day of rest. Mail was delivered on Sundays until the 1850s. For the first 60 years of the American Republic, mail was delivered 7 days a week, and militant Baptist evangelicals insisted on mail delivery on Sunday because they said the church could not endorse a religious day, could not recognize a religious day of rest. Now, we were way past that now. We have a much more relaxed secularism in the United States, and I can imagine many, many different forms of secular democracy taking shape. The test, though, even of is there a new model of democracy in Turkey, say? Well, the test will be if the party currently ruling Turkey ever agrees to step down and allow another party to rule. I have doubts about that possibility, but if that happens, then we will know that there is a Turkish democracy, and it may be quite different from American democracy or French democracy, which are different from each other. Do American Jews share my critique of the settler militants? Probably not, but they haven't spent as much time here as I have. There is great anxiety in the United States among conservative and Reform Jews, who make up the great majority of American Jews, with the growing power of the Orthodox and the ultra-Orthodox in this country. The issue of security prevents any sharp critique of Israel, and until Israel is safe, I expect American Jews will not be critical, but there is great unhappiness and great uneasiness with Orthodox positions on conversion, on marriage, on many, many issues. And if there was ever peace, there would be a great battle, not only here in Israel, but within world Jewry. And I think the denominational pluralism would win out, even here. But that's a long time coming.
Well, I'd like, in your name, all of us, we are most thankful to Professor Walzer for his keynote address, which as a real key opened up all kinds of new doors to us, open them ajar, and we are looking forward to speculate furthermore or find more proof to hypothesis that he put out today, and we're most thankful for sharing his insights with us. Thank you, Professor Walzer.